Today is one of those days where we do a historical reenactment. So I'm going to say that you are, well, today you're going to be Lyndon Johnson. You're going to be Lyndon Johnson and you have a big decision to make. So this is a continuation of America's policy toward Vietnam. And the decision you have to make is you're the new president and there is a new regime in South Vietnam. The war there, that is the struggle between the communists of North Vietnam and the anti-communist forces of South Vietnam, is not going well for the South Vietnamese side. It looks as though Ho Chi Minh, the communist leader of North Vietnam, is on the verge of taking over all of South Vietnam and completing his lifelong project of uniting Vietnam under Vietnamese control, which means under his control and under communist control. So a reminder, the complicating factor for the United States, for most Americans in Vietnam, is that while Ho Chi Minh is a nationalist, and in American thinking that's a plus, he's also a communist. In American thinking, especially by this time, that's a minus. So between these pluses and the minuses, where do you balance out? By the 1960s, something else is at play. The United States has been supporting the anti-communist government of South Vietnam in one form or another for nearly 15 years. So it supported the anti-communist side under the French in the early 1950s, then under Ngo Dinh Diem, the president recently ousted, overthrown, and killed after that. So in the thinking of American leaders, there's American credibility on the line. And credibility, do people believe that you are going to do what you say you're going to do, was considered to be very important by American leaders, especially during this period. Because in the previous 15 years, almost exactly coinciding with the American support of the anti-communist side in South Vietnam, the United States had built this global system of alliances. And alliances are essentially promises, especially on the part of the United States. The United States promised that it would go to the defense of Western Europe, the allies in NATO, if there was a communist attack. The United States had formed alliances with South Korea. The United States would again come to the assistance of South Korea. The United States had formed effective alliances with Taiwan, the anti-communist government of Taiwan. The United States had formed alliances with countries of the Middle East. So there were all of these promises that the United States had given. If you are attacked by communists in particular, we will come to your aid. So the United States had been giving these effectively sort of promises in one form or another to the government of South Vietnam that we will come to your aid. Having done this for over a decade, the United States having done this over a decade, can Johnson then say, you know, it's not working out, so we're getting out of here? So there's this question of credibility. And the credibility, as Johnson sees it, as many people in the United States see it, go far beyond Vietnam. So, and this is, again, sort of what makes this thing complicated. And I've pointed to Vietnam, the American experience there, and as illustration of the second law of history, that things are complicated. They're always complicated. So here's the kind of irony of this, the irony being where things don't turn out as you think they're going to. Vietnam was a small country, far from the United States, and almost never did Americans think that Vietnam itself was crucial to American security. Sometimes Johnson would say really overblown things, but the importance of Vietnam to America's sort of global strategy was that it represented a promise by the United States. And if the promise of the United States to defend South Vietnam isn't upheld, then can other countries to whom the United States has made promises, can they count on the United States? And if they begin to think they cannot count on the United States, what will they do then? Japan, for example. The United States had this treaty of defense and alliance with Japan. Japan had agreed, as part of the post-war settlement, not to have an army and navy, armed forces. Japan had been this powerful military established an empire in the 1920s and 1930s, which had led to World War II in the Pacific. But after the war, the Japanese said no, But the reason they said no to a military establishment was that the United States had promised to defend Japan. Against whom? Well, by the late 1950s and 1960s, against China. China and Japan had been traditional rivals. So if the Japanese began to think that the American promise wasn't worth anything, the Japanese would feel a strong incentive to build up their own military establishment. And only 20 years after the end of World War II, American leaders didn't want to see that because the United States fought against Japan in World War II. Same thing in Europe. By the 1960s, West Germany is a member of the NATO alliance. But it's also on the front lines against the communist forces of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And the Germans essentially have agreed not to rebuild their military on anything like what Hitler had developed. In particular, the Germans had effectively agreed not to develop nuclear weapons. Well, they only did this knowing they had this guarantee from the United States that we will come to your aid using nuclear weapons if necessary if you're attacked by the Soviet Union. And the Germans didn't particularly want to go nuclear, and they didn't want to have to develop a really big army like they had under Hitler. They had bad memories of this too, but if they thought that the United States was going back on its promises, let's say to South Vietnam, then the Germans might have a change of heart. And the last thing Americans wanted was Germany to develop a new army, because the United States had fought against the German army twice in the 20th century. They didn't want to have to do it a third time. So the point of all of this is that Vietnam is this big deal, not so much for what Vietnam is all by itself, but for what Vietnam represents. So you're Lyndon Johnson, you have to deal with this. There's something else you have to think about. And you're Lyndon Johnson, and for you this is a different calculation than for the previous presidents who've been involved in Vietnam. Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John Kennedy. Harry Truman became president by accident. He had no grand agenda. He found himself to be America's father of the Cold War, and he developed this strong feeling about foreign policy. Dwight Eisenhower, he became president by virtue of foreign policy, in particular World War II. And so for Eisenhower, foreign policy stuff came naturally, and that was what he was good at and what he emphasized. John Kennedy as well. John Kennedy really gravitated toward foreign policy. His domestic political agenda was pretty modest. So for the three presidents who got the United States into Vietnam, they were presidents who thought a lot about foreign policy and valued accomplishment in foreign policy. For each of those three, domestic stuff took second place. Lyndon Johnson was just the reverse. Lyndon Johnson was a domestic politics and policy guy from the beginning. He had gotten into politics for reasons of domestic politics, domestic policy. It was during the Great Depression. He was a New Deal Democrat, a supporter of Franklin Roosevelt, bringing electrification to the Texas Hill Country. And he thought in terms of domestic agendas. He wanted to complete the New Deal. He was somebody who thought the New Deal was a good start on expanding opportunities for people in America who have been left out in the course of American history. That's what the New Deal was all about at its visionary heart. And Johnson recognized that there were certain groups who were left out even by the New Deal, in particular African Americans. Johnson, a Southerner from Texas, recognized that, well, the things were as bad as things were for poor people in the United States, they were additionally bad for poor black people in the United States. And Johnson understood that the Jim Crow system in the United States was a violation of the rights that were supposed to be guaranteed to African Americans by the Constitution. But those portions of the Constitution, the 14th and 15th Amendments, had effectively been nullified by Southern states, Southern governments, for generations. And he wanted to do something about it. So Johnson went into politics believing that he was the one who could drag the American South into the 20th century. He was the one who was going to make a name for himself and do good for the country in terms of civil rights. Civil rights was at the top of his agenda, and closely connected to civil rights was improvement in the lives of poor people, giving greater opportunity to the ordinary people of America. So this is why Johnson got into politics, not for matters of foreign policy. Johnson was added to the Kennedy ticket in 1960 in hopes that Johnson would bring Texas on board and some of the South. It was a very close contest. John Kennedy squeaked into office, and Lyndon Johnson came in as his vice president. Now, Johnson was an example of a president who probably could not have gotten in the White House through the front door. Theodore Roosevelt was another one like this, who didn't have the broad political support to win a nomination of his party or an election in the country at large, but who perhaps could become a very good president if he could somehow become president. Well, that's how Theodore Roosevelt became president upon the death of William McKinley by assassination, and Lyndon Johnson became president upon the death of John Kennedy by assassination. So Johnson, as of the end of 1964, is president of the United States, and he has to figure out what to do. He's inherited this situation in Vietnam, and in the several weeks after the overthrow and assassination of President Diem, things have gotten only more confusing in Vietnam. And there isn't a new strong leader that American leaders had hoped would come in and take charge, a strong, popular leader who could mobilize support in South Vietnam. In fact, it became a revolving door of one leader after another, who each one was less popular than the one who went before. Meanwhile, the insurgency within South Vietnam, these are the ones people who live in South Vietnam, although some of them were migrants from North Vietnam at the time of the division of the two halves of the country. They were rising up against the regime in Saigon, and their revolt simply grew more effective and more threatening with each passing month. So by the summer of 1965, Lyndon Johnson has to make a big decision. Basically, it comes down to this. Are you going to fish or cut bait? Are you, Lyndon Johnson, going to up the ante on the part of the United States, or are you going to pull out? Because this stuff that's going on now, it looks like it's going to get the worst of both worlds. The United States is involved, but is not winning. And so for the United States to be involved and lose, that's as bad as can be. If you pull out, you get maybe the blame for the people who don't want you to pull out. You get the blame for pulling out, but at least you don't get the blame for losing the war after trying. Again, credibility is on the line. Credibility means keeping your promise effectively, not just going to the aid of your allies, but defending them effectively. And it's probably the worst thing is if you go to the aid of your allies and fail, because then you look like a paper tiger. So Johnson has to make this decision. Am I going to push more chips onto the table, or am I going to pull out and fold? But complicating Johnson's situation, remember the theme of all this is about complications. Complicating Johnson's calculation on this is the fact that he doesn't want to have to deal with Vietnam. Foreign policy is not what he gets up in the morning to do. Johnson is all about domestic affairs. Johnson is all about what he has come to call the Great Society. And the Great Society, the society of Johnson's vision, is a society that is fairer to people in this country, that gives greater opportunity to ordinary people in this country, that is better for ordinary folks and not just for the wealthy. Things have been going really well for rich folks for a long time in the United States, but it's the poor folks who have been left out, especially racial minorities. So Johnson wants to be the civil rights president. He wants to be the president of opportunity for the poor. As of the summer of 1965, he has succeeded in one big deal. He managed to persuade Congress, he had to twist some arms, into approving the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which effectively outlawed the Jim Crow system of segregation. And this was a first step. But Johnson saw that there was another big step coming. And that big step coming, the one that would actually guarantee that the Civil Rights Act not be repealed, because it's important. A federal law passed by Congress can be repealed by Congress. And Johnson recognized that, okay, this law was passed by Congress, it might be repealed. How can I guarantee that it not be repealed? it had to be followed by a Voting Rights Act. And a Voting Rights Act would guarantee to black people in the South the right to vote. The 15th Amendment supposedly guaranteed this vote to African Americans, but ways had been devised to frustrate it since the 1870s and 1880s. And Johnson wanted to make sure that that was no longer possible. He was going to put federal teeth into voting rights. Voting rights until then had been essentially a matter for states to deal with. And the states decided how old you had to be to vote and where the polling places were going to be. A federal Voting Rights Act would make sure that the feds were involved in enforcing voting rights for African Americans in the South. So this is what Johnson wants to get through Congress. He believes that this is even more important than the Civil Rights Act because it's going to be the one that's going to open the door to black participation in Southern politics. And if black people are voting, are able to vote, if they're able to hold office, then they will be able to guarantee themselves political rights, civil rights into the future. So Johnson, in the spring of 1965, is most concerned about getting this Voting Rights Act passed. But his generals, his diplomats, his advisors for South Vietnam keep tugging on his sleeve saying, Mr. President, we need a decision on Vietnam. So Johnson is trying to figure out what to do. If he devotes his energy to Vietnam, he thinks he's going to distract Congress, distract the American people, distract himself from the struggle for the Voting Rights Act and the larger Great Society. And Johnson doesn't want to do that. So he's trying to figure out, what do I do? What do you do if you're Lyndon Johnson? What do you do? You have to accept for the sake of my argument that you're really committed to domestic reform. And you've got this foreign policy problem that just won't go away. So what do? Do you put domestic reform on hold and say, okay, you guys just hold the line there and I'll get back to you? The problem with this is that the pressure for the Voting Rights Act was increasing. Martin Luther King was leading marches in the South, and Southern resistance to the marches was getting more and more violent, and there was going to be an explosion in the United States. If something wasn't done to deliver on the promise of civil rights and voting rights. So that was something Johnson couldn't put off. He thought, maybe I can put off what's going on in Vietnam. So Johnson is presented with proposals by his generals, by the Defense Department. And these all say, okay, Mr. President, you got to make a choice. You either pull out of Vietnam or you send a lot more troops to Vietnam. Because where we are in the middle, it's just an unviable position. And Johnson concludes, okay, either one of those extremes is unacceptable. If I pull out, then the Republicans will just pound me over the head about losing Vietnam, losing South Vietnam. This is something the Republicans have been pointing fingers at the Democrats ever since Harry Truman allegedly lost China. And Johnson didn't want to deal with that because he realized that would probably derail his domestic political reform program. So he's unwilling to pull out of Vietnam. On the other hand, he's also unwilling to give the generals all the troops, all the stuff that they want. They want to make it a full-blown war. Because if you're a general, you tend to think, for understandable reasons, that if we're in here to fight, we ought to be in here to win. No general wants to send troops into action saying, guys, you're just there to hold the line. Don't lose, but we're not going to let you win. You can't give stirring pre-battle speeches in that regard. And it's effectively an intolerable situation for the soldiers. So the soldiers basically say, either get out or go all in. And Johnson won't get out for the reasons I just said, nor will he go all in because he thinks that would require perhaps a declaration of war by Congress, and he doesn't want Congress debating a war declaration. At the time, he wants them to be focusing on civil rights reform, voting rights in particular. So Johnson splits the difference. He doesn't pull out, but neither does he give the generals all that they want. He gives them more troops. He agrees to send 50,000 more troops, which is a big chunk. It greatly increases the number of Americans already in Vietnam. And he leaves open the possibility there are going to be more after that. But he doesn't want to get Congress involved in a big debate over Vietnam policy. He's definitely not going to ask for a declaration of war. He's not going to declare a national emergency. He needs to keep Congress and the American political system focused on civil rights, and the Great Society. So the period of American escalation sets in. This is sometimes called the Americanization of the war in Vietnam. So imagine that you are a soldier of South Vietnam, and you see all these American troops coming along, and you think, well, okay, if they're coming, let's let them do the fighting. And that's exactly what happens. So as American troops come, they're better equipped. They've got more tanks, they've got more planes, they've got more everything. The South Vietnamese largely step aside, and the Americans wind up doing most of the fighting on the South Vietnamese side in the Vietnam War. And this persists for 3 years. And the Johnson administration and officials of the American government give these rosy estimates of how things are going. And a phrase that is often cited is, we see a light at the end of the tunnel. Yeah, things aren't going so well right now, but we think we're getting closer. And there were various measures for how the war was progressing. And one was the body count. It was taken as a war of attrition because there are these insurgents in South Vietnam. Some of them, these are the Viet Cong, the members of the NLF, the National Liberation Front. Some are being infiltrated across the border between North Vietnam and South Vietnam from North Vietnam. And it's not really a war for territory so much as there was this thinking, if we can just, on the part of America's military leadership, if we can kill enough of the soldiers on the communist side, then eventually they'll give up. Johnson added to the American effort by launching large American bombing raids of North Vietnam. This is something that the United States had a big advantage. American bombers could bomb cities, could bomb military installations in North Vietnam, and basically cause pain in North Vietnam. The thinking of the Johnson administration was, if we demonstrate to the North Vietnamese that every time they try to increase fighting in the South, we're going to increase the pain in the North, and they'll look at things and say, well, we, North Vietnam, we're a small, relatively poor country. The United States is this large, really rich country. There's no way we can outlast the Americans. And so this was the Johnson administration's thinking. We can keep this thing under control. Meanwhile, Johnson's domestic program is rolling through Congress, and pieces of Great Society legislation are coming thick and fast, and Johnson's very pleased about that. Meanwhile, there's this nagging thing going on in Vietnam. But nonetheless, the administration is putting a positive spin on things, and Americans are starting to think, okay, things in Vietnam are under control. Then, in the early part of 1968, comes something called the Tet Offensive. Tet, T-E-T, is the Lunar New Year, celebrated by the Vietnamese and other peoples in Asia. And as the timing was coincidental with the New Year, that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, the communist side in the war in Vietnam, they launched this big offensive all across South Vietnam. And they demonstrate in this offensive that the war in Vietnam is not anywhere near being over. That the communists, far from losing support of the people, far from losing strength, they're going to be able to keep this fight going on maybe forever. This is a real eye-opener for Americans. Now, I need to stress something here, something that was different about Vietnam from previous wars. Vietnam was the first of American wars to be shown on television. So TV was in its infancy during the Korean War. And Americans really couldn't watch much of the Korean War on television in their living rooms at home. But by the 1960s, it was entirely possible to do exactly that. And so footage from Vietnam showing these attacks in cities and towns and villages all across South Vietnam demonstrated very clearly to the American people that what the Johnson administration had been saying didn't square with reality. This war wasn't anywhere near over. There was no light at the end of the tunnel, or if there was, the tunnel was really long. It was going to take a long time to get to that end. So this was a shock to the American system. Johnson challenged for the nomination for the Democratic nomination by a member of his own party in 1968, stuns the American political system by announcing that he is not going to run for election in 1968. Effectively, Johnson is announcing that the war in Vietnam has defeated me. And this throws open the election. It's going to be an open election in 1968, and it's an open question sort of what this is going to do. The election turns out to be won by Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, a Republican, is elected in 1968. He has talked about what he calls a secret plan to end the war. And when asked to reveal his secret, he says, well, if I told you, it wouldn't be a secret. Well, it was a little bit more than that, because he took what he sort of presented as the high road. I can't tip my hand before I'm President of the United States. It would undermine the existing president. Lyndon Johnson is still president. So Nixon is elected, and it turns out his secret plan to end the war is a secret plan to end primary American responsibility for fighting the war. I described the earlier period as the Americanization of the war. What Nixon starts is the Vietnamization of the war, pulling American ground troops out of battle and giving more aid to the Army of South Vietnam so the South Vietnamese can do more of the fighting. And to a lot of Americans, this made a lot of sense. After all, it's their country. They ought to be fighting to defend it. So the Vietnamization of the war takes place. Now, to bolster the South Vietnamese, Nixon ramps up the bombing of North Vietnam. This is something that doesn't create a great number of American casualties. Nixon was shrewd. Nixon understood that much of the American animus against the war, much of the American hostility to the war, was due to the fact that Americans were getting killed in large numbers. Americans, understandably, were very much less concerned about the number of South Vietnamese who were killed. And so Nixon's thinking was, if the people getting killed in Vietnam are South Vietnamese, then the war can go on. And the United States will provide money to South Vietnam, will provide air support to South Vietnam, and we can keep the war going. Now, Nixon had to reckon with one thing that Ho Chi Minh had figured out long ago, and this is something that George Washington had figured out in America's War of National Liberation. When you are the side on the inside fighting to get rid of the foreigners, you don't have to win the war so much as you have to avoid losing the war. As long as you can keep fighting, then you can keep the struggle going, because sooner or later, that occupying power, the British in the case of the American Revolution, the Americans in the case of the war in Vietnam, they have the option. They can say enough is enough and turn around and go home. And this was exactly the thinking in the United States by the early 1970s. Opposition to the war in the form of protests against the war, student riots against the war. This was something that had been going on for some time. The riots in particular were getting larger. There were showdowns with National Guard. Student protesters were getting killed in some of these protests. And so Nixon hoped to put this behind by pulling the United States out of the war and leaving it to the South Vietnamese. This was his long-term goal. Things got messed up for Nixon. Oh, and he was thinking that with American aid, the government of South Vietnam can maintain itself. And so the United States would have this victory, would have kept communism at bay, and the United States would no longer have be exposed to all these American deaths. But Nixon got ensnared by his own Watergate scandal. And from the beginning of 1973 through his forced resignation from office in the summer of 1974, Nixon was focused on Watergate. And this essentially paralyzed the president. So Nixon finally managed to, with Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor and then Secretary of State, managed to negotiate what were called the Paris Peace Accords of early 1973, which said that American troops will be leaving South Vietnam. This is very much like the French pullout in 1954. So American troops are going to be leaving South Vietnam. The United States still reserved the option to support the government of South Vietnam and maybe to provide air cover to South Vietnam. But the United States, American troops would no longer be doing the fighting. And this was the Paris Peace Accords, and American combat troops pull out of Vietnam. And in exchange, the communist side agrees to a ceasefire. Okay, we're going to stop fighting. Now, they didn't say this isn't a peace settlement. We didn't say we are giving up our decades-long struggle to get rid of the foreigners, but we will stop the fighting. Pretty much everybody understood that the fighting would resume at some point, because the communists, Ho Chi Minh is dead by this time, but the communists aren't going to give up what they'd been fighting for forever. And so it was no great surprise that in the spring of 1975, 2 years after the signing of the Paris Accords, the fighting resumes. By this time, Nixon is out of office, Gerald Ford is president, and the American people have no stomach to send troops back into Vietnam. And so the end comes quickly. In just a space of 6 weeks, Saigon falls to the communists, and the communists' decades-long struggle to get rid of the foreigners, to complete the nationalist liberation of Vietnam, is done. The Vietnam War is over for the United States. It's the end of a long, tragic, sad story for the United States. For the Vietnamese, some of them were happy, some of them were appalled, thinking, oh my God, now, you know what, that nationalist revolution was also a communist revolution. Now we have to deal with this. But that's a story for a later date.